Welcome to the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM. And we've got two very interesting guests tonight, Scott Horton and Jesselyn Radack. And I want to jump right into the conversation. And Jesselyn, tell us a little bit about your background. And you've got an amazing story, really. You're a whistleblower. You're a former member of the Department of Justice as an attorney. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
I was a legal advisor to the Justice Department on ethics matters. I had given advice back in 2001 in the case of the so-called American Taliban, John Walker Lind. The criminal division had wanted to know if they could interview him without a lawyer being present. And I was told unambiguously that his father had retained counsel for him. So in accordance with our usual practice, I advised that he should not be questioned without his lawyer. Apparently, the FBI on the ground in Afghanistan went ahead and questioned him over the weekend, and the same attorney came back to me on Monday and said, oops, what do we do now? And I advised that the interview might have to be sealed and used only for national security or intelligence gathering purposes, but not criminal prosecution. Again, that advice was ignored. And in the aftermath, then Attorney General John Ashcroft held a number of his dramatic press conferences announcing that a complaint was being filed against John Walker Lind. And he made a couple of very interesting statements that I knew were not true, such as the subject here is entitled to choose his own lawyer and to our knowledge has not chosen a lawyer at this time, and that John Walker Lind's rights had been carefully, scrupulously honored. I knew for a fact both of those statements were false. But the real problem for me came when I inadvertently learned on March 7th that the judge presiding over the Lind case had ordered that all Justice Department correspondence related to Lind's interrogation be submitted to the court. And normally at the Justice Department, these orders are disseminated to everybody with even a small connection to the case. But I heard about it only because the Lind prosecutor had contacted me directly. And then when I went to comply with it, I was also alarmed that he only had 2 of my emails because I knew I had written more than a dozen. I went and checked our hard copy file, and the emails containing my assessment that the FBI had committed an ethics violation were missing from the file. So I basically resurrected those emails from my computer archives, read a memo to my boss documenting the emails and attaching them, and made a copy to take home with me in case they, quote, unquote, disappeared again, and then I resigned. As Lynn's case came closer and closer to trial, the Justice Department continued to take the position that he was not represented by counsel, which made me seriously concerned whether my emails ever reached the court. And at that point, I disclosed my emails to Newsweek magazine in accordance with the Whistleblower Protection Act. And that essentially ended the Lind case. It settled on the eve of a suppression hearing on exactly that issue, whether or not the statements he made could be used against him. But then, I thought it was all over, but that was only the beginning of the department's vituperative retaliation against me. It basically put me under criminal investigation, referred me to the state bars in which I'm licensed as an attorney, put me on the no-fly list, got me fired from my private law firm by telling them that I was a criminal, contested my unemployment compensation benefits. I mean, the list goes on. And it's 8 years later, and I'm still dealing with the fallout from this.
Well, okay, one thing that comes to mind is you did this based on the Witness Protection. Well, how did you describe it?
The Whistleblower Protection Act.
Whistleblower Protection Act. Now, I've had a lot of contact with whistleblowers. Spoke at the meeting last year, actually. And from what I hear, the Department of Justice is just about the most horrific enemy of whistleblowers there is.
Yeah, during my time at the department, John Ashcroft had actually created an anti-leak task force. It's hard to get into a competition of which government agency carries the American Express gold card of retaliation against whistleblowers, because a lot of them are horrendous. But the Department of Justice during the Bush years was particularly horrible.
So right now, you have problems still with the Department of Justice? Are there charges against you or accusations against you?
The referral they referred me to the D.C. bar, and that referral is still pending after almost 7 years. And when Bar Counsel has contacted the department, they've said, oh, yeah, we still, want to maintain this. So that still hangs over my head, and I still have trouble flying, being on the secondary, the selectee portion of the no-fly list.
So does this mean that Eric Holder and his DOJ is involved in the current status that you have with the D.C. bar?
My guess is that, I give Eric Holder the benefit of the doubt of not being in the weeds of my case, but it was news to me recently that David Margolis was the point person who downgraded bar charges against the torture memo authors John Yoo and Bybee. I know that David Margolis was very close with my former boss. So again, this whole thing is like a jigsaw puzzle, and every couple months I get another piece to it. It doesn't surprise me at all that David Margolis has been driving the bus behind keeping the bar referral against me alive.
Who is he? What's his story?
David Margolis is he's a career bureaucrat who has been with the department for more than 40 years. He is an associate deputy attorney general, which is normally a political position, but he's managed somehow to carve that into a career position. And I don't know who died and left David Margolis in charge of overriding anything that OPR, the Office of Professional Responsibility, does. But apparently he's the man behind the curtain, so to speak, in terms of these kinds of ethics investigations. And Scott has more expertise on this than I do.
Well, I know that among the last things that the Bush administration did was switch a lot of jobs from political appointee to long-term career appointee. Is he one of those? Was he originally a political appointee?
He was in the department long before Bush was. I imagine that he started off, I'm guessing, as a political and then converted somehow to a career. But I don't know the trajectory of his tenure because he's been there for so long.
So the toxic behaviors that he's engaging now may be a harbinger of what we have to come for hundreds of other Bush appointees who were turned into career people. Scary.
That's an unfortunate but realistic possibility to the extent that people were burrowing in towards the end of the Bush administration.
Now, the last thing I want to say before I bring in Scott Horton is that this current situation of yours, is really accentuated by the fact that you raised that you and Bybee were basically given a pass. And now you're from what I understand, you're the only attorney in the DOJ who is still being penalized in any way from the previous administration.
That's right. I'm the only Justice Department attorney to be referred by OPR for bar discipline based on advice I gave in a terrorism case, and my advice was to give someone their rights, to accord a criminal suspect his rights. There have been a lot of irregularities in how OPR has handled this process with me. They referred me based on possible misconduct, which goes against their own standard. Normally they only refer people after finding professional misconduct or finding intentional misconduct or reckless disregard of an applicable standard or obligation. That's their benchmark. But they referred me based on a secret report for possible misconduct. I was referred for conduct I engaged in as a private citizen, not as a public servant, after I had left the Justice Department. And basically, it was used as a pretext to conduct a witch hunt. That's my opinion, and that's the opinion of a lot of other legal scholars who've written articles about my case.
You there, Scott?
Yeah, I am.
So we have a situation now where two people who I would guess millions of Americans believe are engaged in criminal actions, you and Bybee, that have shamed America in terms of their policy influence on torture. And then you have a person who has done something that was in pursuit of justice, and Jesselyn's now still a victim. What's your take on all this, especially in light of these recent decisions?
Well, I think it's a really stark contrast, because here we have John Yoo and Jay Bybee, who violated their oaths given as Justice Department officials to faithfully uphold and execute the laws. Instead, they sought to subvert and pervert them, and they issued bogus legal opinions as a direct result of which hundreds of people died and numerous people were tortured. And we can contrast that with Jesselyn Radack, who did exactly the right thing, issued completely appropriate legal opinions. She discovered that the Justice Department was in the process of obstruction by failing to give, by failing to turn over documents that had been requested in a court proceeding. Now, that act of failing to turn over these documents, in this case, we should note, someone had gone through the physical files at the Justice Department, removed and destroyed the documents which were sought under this court order. That was a criminal act of obstruction. And there's pretty good evidence that suggests that 2 or 3 very senior Justice Department officials were involved. In fact, Alice Fisher, who was at that point the deputy head of the criminal division, there is evidence linking her to the removal of these files at the time these documents existed. That was a felony that was committed at this point. Instead of investigating the crime and taking action on it, what do? They launch a massive vendetta against the individual who exposed their criminal conduct. They make false statements against her. They prepare a report and seal it as secret. And then they produce innuendo about what is in the report and use this to try and get her fired and disbarred. If a private employer did what they did, the private employer would be behind bars, would be in jail, and would be the subject of a major prosecution. So this is arrogance, impunity, criminality run rampant. The Department of Justice behaving as if it were a criminal enterprise.
So, is there any recourse at this point? Is there? Because this isn't the only problem that we have with the Justice Department. I've interviewed Cyril Wecht and John McTiernan, and I've spoken with Don Siegelman. There are a lot of victims out there who have been subject to prosecutorial misconduct and abuse of the power of the Department of Justice.
But there's another case involving David Margolis that you just referred to, Governor Siegelman. One of the members of the prosecution team, a woman named Tamara Grimes down in Montgomery, Alabama, came forward and disclosed that the prosecutors handling the case against Governor Siegelman had fabricated evidence and have withheld exculpatory evidence. And she insisted that they fix this. And what happens? The Department of Justice launches a massive vendetta against her, and notwithstanding the express provisions of the Whistleblower Protection Act, she's fired. And who's in the background authorizing all of that? David Margolis is. Again, the same man.
And who is in the background defending her is my organization, the Government Accountability Project, because after going through this nightmare, I've dedicated myself to representing whistleblowers.
Well, that's good. Now,
but in theory, our Justice Department should be upholding and enforcing the law, and instead what it does is subvert and trample upon it.
That's what I've seen again and again, and I really had hoped and expected that the Obama administration would do something differently. And when Obama came to office, I knew he was not a progressive. I knew that we weren't going to see huge changes in some policies, but I really believed that the Justice Department wrongs would be righted. And it's looking to me, and I've been saying this for a while, that Eric Holder could be just as bad or even worse than Gonzalez because of his failure to right the wrongs.
I think
we're still just 1 year into the process. I have to say I rather like Eric Holder as an individual, but he doesn't strike me as a strong attorney general. He strikes me as rather weak and not someone who's prepared to engage the problems that the department has and try and set the house in order. He's really done virtually nothing. And in the meantime, the Department of Justice is just imploding right now. We've had in just the last few weeks, we had the Stevens prosecution come unraveled. We had Judge Urbina dismiss the highest profile prosecution the department has, which was against the 7 Blackwater gunmen who were involved in the massacre at Nisour Square in Baghdad. We had the Broadcom prosecution in Orange County, California, collapse with the federal judge there accusing the prosecutors of behaving like thugs in a totalitarian society, making false representations to the court, even trying to intimidate a 13-year-old child to get the child to make false statements against his father. The situation, I think, is just, it's painful and it's terrible. And there's really been nothing done to get the house in order.
I agree with that. And I think part of the problem can be pinned on the Justice Department, but a bigger part of the problem, and believe me, I love President Obama, and I worked for very hard for his election, but this decision, we're going to look forward. We're not going to get mired in the past. We're not going to look backwards. Well, the Bush years are some of the worst years in recent memory and one of the biggest stains on the rule of law that's occurred in half a century. And this steadfast refusal to look back is what is, I just can't even describe how upsetting that is. It just provides no accountability.
It's literally people getting away with murder, quite literally murder, because homicides are not being investigated.
Well, how much power does Margolis have in terms of the Eric Holder, the Attorney General?
Well, Margolis and Holder, let me just give you a little bit more background about him. He is a career justice employee. He's not a political appointee. He came up on the criminal side, in fact, the Organized Crime Task Force. And Philip Heyman, who was a Deputy Attorney General in the Clinton years, brought him up to the top of the administration, making him an Associate Deputy Attorney General. So he's been in that position for a long time through both Republican and Democratic administrations. And both of them like him basically because he covers the posterior of political appointees. It really doesn't matter whether they are Democrats or Republicans. He will look after them and take care of them. That's the role he's been playing there since, roughly 1992.
Wow. So he's basically, it reminds me of J. Edgar Hoover. He had dirt on everybody, and he could operate with such power because of that. This guy keeps the dirt off of people, or keeps them out of trouble?
It's a little bit more positive. I mean, he's known as the cleaner. That's his nickname. Somebody gets in trouble, somebody makes a mess, and he will go clean it up in a way in which those who made the mess will suffer no harm. He'll protect them. And it's because of those qualities that he has endeared himself so much to the political figures, and they keep him at the top of the Justice Department. It's one hand washes the other, and it's really a fundamentally corrupt relationship. But we have to note, it doesn't have anything to do with partisanship. It's not Democrat or Republican. It's simply universally corrupt.
So one of the highest level people in the Department of Justice is, now you say it's a corrupt relationship. I mean, I'm trying to see how to phrase this. If I was writing like a headline or something, it's a corrupt relationship. Does that mean that the highest levels of the Justice Department, there's corruption?
Yes, of course.
Can you say that?
Well, the corruption here is that he takes care of them. They don't have to worry about their dirty laundry getting out, and they don't have to worry about suffering real consequences for their wrongdoing, including criminal wrongdoing. And the tit for tat is that Dave Margolis stays as the highest career figure in the department. He justifies this in his mind as protecting the reputation of the institution. But in fact, what he's doing is demolishing the reputation of the institution, because the complete lack of accountability, the impunity of the institution has destroyed its reputation. It's at the lowest point it's been in modern times right now. And really the principal person who has brought it so low is David Margolis.
Until a few days ago, his role was virtually unknown to me, though now some of the punitive aspects of my case make sense. As a case in point, my former boss passed away, and her obituary said that she received the Lifetime Achievement Award, which was completely not true. And then I looked up where this came about, and it turns out Margolis had received the Lifetime Achievement Award, and somehow, I guess, to redeem her, passed this information on to be used in her obituary, that she had received it. Claudia Flynn had received it. So he seems to be willing to go to great lengths to not only clean up a mess, but to rehabilitate people who are really beyond. You would think people like John Yoo and Bybee would be beyond redemption, yet he's willing to go out of his way to rehabilitate their career. And instead of being concerned about rehabilitating the beleaguered Department of Justice, somehow he's more concerned about rehabilitating John Yoo and Bybee, who, by the way, are going to be just fine because John Yoo has tenure and Bybee has a lifetime appointment as a federal judge.
Unless he's impeached.
Unless he's impeached, which I'm not holding my breath on. But accountability needs to start somewhere, and clearly the Justice Department cannot police its own. It's not going to come from the Justice Department. So at this point, I think it's incumbent upon the legal community, which is a self-policing body, to take action.
We should note, since you're broadcasting in Pennsylvania, that, of course, John Yoo is a member of the Pennsylvania Bar. And as the OPR report itself notes, it's really the Pennsylvania Bar that would have to become involved here and decide whether he's going to be held to account for his misconduct. I mean, they clearly determine, everybody agrees he engaged in extremely serious misconduct. But, of course, David Margolis decides that there should be no consequences from the misconduct. But Margolis also agrees that he's in no position to stop the Bar of Pennsylvania from dealing with John Yoo's misconduct and punishing John Yoo if they conclude that that's the right thing to do.
That's something that you will hear more from now that I know that. This is something that my colleagues and I are going to get on. Now let me ask you this. I'm hearing horror stories about Margolis. How much of this has been covered in the media, and whether it's mainstream or progressive or any media? Is this something that you're a regular on Daily Kuz, Jesselyn? Do you see anything about Margolis there?
No, I think he's flown largely under the radar screen. It wasn't until the Yoo and Bybee memos were released on Friday, along with a supplemental report by David Margolis, that I saw clearly that David Margolis, this single person, could unilaterally downgrade and overturn effectively what the OPR did. And suddenly, again, it's like pieces of a puzzle for me, but suddenly it made a lot more sense that he was the person behind the overzealous, and that's an understatement, attack on me. I don't think most Americans recognize the name David Margolis. I know, but for someone who's, Scott can speak to, maybe he's better known within academic circles as having the power that he does.
What about you? He's intensely secretive, and he likes to manipulate things from behind the scenes. And I've actually talked in the last few days with 3 lawyers who worked very closely with him over the last 20 years, who, and I should say, none of them respect him. They consider him to be, one described him to me as being downright evil. He manipulates things. He writes memoranda and instructs other people to sign the memos so that his name will not be there and he can be outside of a paper path. But he's highly manipulative, and he's a very, very skilled bureaucratic infighter. People who cross him find themselves being the subject of attack and aggressive moves to get them fired. That's something he's done over the last 30 years, in fact.
That actually just sparked a memory that I have, that people used to refer to him as sort of the consigliere of the Justice Department. And
which is a mob boss, we should say.
Right, exactly.
Understand they're Italian.
Which made me just...
A mob lawyer, I should say.
So, Scott, have you seen any coverage of this anywhere in the mainstream media? Have you written about him before?
Yes, I mean, I've written pieces about David Margolis for the last 2.5 years now, a whole series of them. And I wrote many months ago that he had been maneuvering, that basically he was supporting Yoo and Bybee, was doing so openly inside the Justice Department, and had been maneuvering for many months to block the issuance of the OPR report. And when Eric Holder made a final decision that he would do the final review, I said, well, that's the end of it, because he will block the issuance of the report. He made completely clear long ago that that was what he was going to do. There are very, very few people who've written about Margolis. There's a big article in National Journal about him. There was a piece in the Los Angeles Times about 1.5 years ago about him, but relatively little, and that's largely because he does his best to keep out of the limelight and out of the press.
It's frightening. I just need to do a little quick station ID. This is the Rob Kall Bottom-Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM, sponsored by opednews.com. And talking with my guests, Jesselyn Radack and Scott Horton. And it's a horror story. This is reality, and it's terrifying. So you said something that really surprised me. You said that Holder had also said that he was going to block the release of the report, the OPR. What does the OPR stand for, by the way?
Office of Professional Responsibility.
And that's a part of the Department of Justice. So
supposedly an internal independent watchdog of the department, which is, if anyone had any doubts that this office actually functioned, those doubts should be resolved after what happened this Friday with you and Bybee.
That's particularly if anybody thinks it functions independently. It does not. It is completely under the control of politicos who run the department.
Any members of Congress talking about this at all?
Yes, there are going to be hearings on Capitol Hill, I think, perhaps very, very soon in the House Judiciary Committee.
The Senate is holding their hearing on Friday, and the only witness is going to be the acting Deputy Attorney General, I guess, Tom Pirelli, which, again, makes me wonder how much they really want to get to the bottom of this, because Pirelli, I've heard, is a good guy, but I think he's just a mouthpiece for whatever the department tells him to say.
Well, that's right. He will have no personal knowledge about any of this.
Right, exactly.
So this is a whitewash that the Senate's engaging in.
That's right. I mean, obviously, it's David Margolis who should be called and should be testifying.
Exactly.
But he evades testimony. He was forced to testify under oath in the U.S. Attorney's matter, and he played a very dishonorable role in the entire U.S. Attorney scandal. In theory, he's the person who should have been there blocking all of these hijinks that went on with the U.S. attorneys, but in fact he facilitated everything. And one very telling event is that when Monica Goodling and Kyle Sampson felt everything was coming out and the house was coming down around them, they went crying and pleading to David Margolis to protect them.
Crying and pleading to David Margolis to
who of course then proceeded in fact to protect them.
This is shocking. That isn't it Senator Leahy that chairs the Senate Judiciary?
Yes.
So he's going to be a part of this. Really.
He's fully aware of my situation.
It's very disturbing.
I've been in communications with his office. He's
so
fully aware.
is there this? It sounds like the stories of the horror stories that have come from the Bush-appointed, Rose-directed Department of Justice are just monstrous. They rip your guts out. They make you want to shoot and do something with your eyes turned red. I can't even say it. It's so outrageous, and it's all going to pass. Nothing's going to be done about this.
Well, is anything going to change? I mean, so we had horrible abuse of the mechanics of the Justice Department for blatantly political purposes. That's when Karl Rove was running the Justice Department, and that's where we saw, Cyril Weck's prosecution, Governor Siegelman's prosecution, Paul Minor's, and so forth. And the reins are passed to Eric Holder, and there's been no change in any of this. Those cases stand. There's been no internal investigation of the abuses. I mean, the case of Siegelman, even after 100 100 attorneys general from around the country petitioned the Justice Department saying that they think there's been gross misconduct by prosecutors. That's something that's never happened before in history. The senior federal judge in Alabama writes a letter to Eric Holder saying that he personally witnessed gross misconduct in connection with the prosecution of the Siegelman matter. And what's happened? Well, again, I'm told by people inside the Justice Department who are familiar with this that David Margolis intervened to block any internal review of the Siegelman matter.
How do you get rid of a guy like that?
It's really well past time for him to retire. But he really should be facing an ethics review before he is allowed to leave the Justice Department.
And I don't think the Justice Department wants to get rid of him or is in a hurry to get rid of him.
Oh, they love him.
Right, exactly.
He provides this essential service to the politicos.
Right, and he provides this patina of being the career bureaucrat who's devoted his entire life to the department, and this sort of patina of legitimacy and of being the wise old man at the department and part of the institution. Now, it's a calcified bureaucracy, in my opinion, but if you want a clean house, start with him.
That's right. I mean, his entire game is about protecting wrongdoers inside the department. That is his entire reason for being there.
But Scott, you just said something else. You said that he's involved in protecting politicos, too. That's a much bigger picture, even uglier and just more dirty.
Yeah, protecting political appointees in the Justice Department. I mean, people like Kyle Sampson and Monica Goodling, but also politically appointed U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys, deputy assistant U.S. attorneys, and so forth. They know they can count on him to whatever they do that's wrong, he will protect them. And that's exactly what's going on in the Bybee matter. But he's done it in ethics reviews of the conduct of U.S. attorneys. He's done it in reviews of political staffers like Kyle Sampson and Monica Goodling. It just goes on and on and on. And he was doing this in the Clinton administration. It's nothing new to the Bush administration. He's done it consistently across the board for all people who hold power.
Does he do it for politicians as well?
Political appointees inside the department.
Just inside. He doesn't do it for politicians.
Well, he really doesn't have any power to do things outside the department.
Well, I guess he could quash investigations, though.
That's more the U.S. attorneys who handle them. I think what he does is he covers the back of those who engage in abusive practices.
I see. How does this affect the United States? How does it affect our democracy? How does it affect our image in the world? How does it affect our national security?
Well, I'd say the reputation of our Justice Department's being dragged in the mud. I mean, you almost have to put quote marks around the word justice at this point. And that's bad. That's damage enough.
I mean, I think a lot of people in the public, a lot of lawyers also, they're not mutually exclusive from the public, but a lot of people saw this as the last iota of possible accountability with John Yoo and Bybee, who really were the architects of the torture policy that was later carried out by CIA operatives. And once the CIA operatives were effectively immunized by statements by Obama and Holder both, a lot of people saw this as, maybe someone here will be held accountable. And although I had no illusions about what was going to happen, and it wasn't a surprise, it was still devastating Friday to hear what happened with OPR's decision and with Margolis's downgrading any finding of misconduct about them. And I'm glad we're talking about this, and I'm glad, I know there's an event being held tomorrow with Scott and Michael Frisch, who represents me in the bar proceeding, and other scholars to talk about the aftermath of the OPR memo, the OPR report. But it really, our standing in the world, suffered immensely, obviously during the Bush years. But if Obama was serious about rehabilitating that, he wouldn't have attorneys going out there continuing to make the same arguments with regard to the state secrets privilege. He wouldn't have this kind of shenanigans about accountability for people who are being investigated, properly investigated for wrongdoing.
Are there still political appointees who Bush appointed operating in the Justice Department now?
Yes, I mean.
Yes, there were a number of people who were political appointees who were converted over into career appointees in the last 6 months of the Bush administration. But we could just look at the level of U.S. attorneys. I mean, Laura Canary, who I think was probably the worst of the Bush U.S. attorneys, is still in Montgomery, Alabama as the U.S. attorney. Hasn't been removed. And we have a number of these embeds that have gone on. We're probably several dozens of them inside the department. We also have the ideologically inspired false hires that occurred, several hundred of them. And Michael Mukasey concluded that, it was a violation of the rules to hire these people, but now we can't fire them. They're permanent. So the answer is yes, many, many such people. I mean, they are a large part of the population of the Department of Justice right now.
What does that do to our security? Does that have an effect on our security as a nation?
Well, I think, the national security arena was intensely politicized, and the Justice Department was an arm of that. But this is an area where I think the abuses have been softened. And I actually see, looking at a number of these prosecutions that have gone on in the last year, I see sudden signs of sobriety and seriousness in the way the prosecutions are being handled. And that does suggest that there is more adult guidance at the helm of the Justice Department than before.
Well, that's good. Who would be doing that?
New U.S. attorneys who've come in largely, but I think also some of the assistant U.S. attorneys who are managing things at Main Justice. And I think what's happened is new people who've come in are really different from Bush-era people, and that many more of them are career or long-term Justice Department officials. They're not people who were brought in because of their service in the political trenches and campaigns.
If you were... Go ahead, Jesselyn.
No, I said, were there membership in the Federalist Society? I mean, there were a lot of people who just did not have qualifications, who were political hacks, who were put into very important positions of power during the Bush years, who burrowed in at the last minute by being, as Scott mentioned, converted to full-time permanent staff positions as opposed to political appointe's.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to sign off now. Have to take off.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's stay with this a little bit longer, Jesselyn, okay? Because
sure.
We kind of switched over to some related topics, but I just want to make sure we cover where you've been with this. We kind of jumped into this whole David Margolis nightmare. Now, you said when you found out on Friday that you felt terrible.
I did. I mean, even though it was entirely predictable, this ordeal for me has been going on since 2001, and it is now 2010. The bar referral itself has been going on for about almost 7 years.
What does that mean, bar referral? Could you explain that in a little more detail?
OPR referred me to the D.C. bar based on a secret report that I did not have access to, and it is up to the D.C. bar to decide whether or not to charge me with misconduct. And a lot of people are like, well, you haven't been charged, so there's no harm. But the harm is this. Just being under a bar referral will increase the malpractice liability insurance of any law firm that would hire me. It also precludes me from becoming a member of the Supreme Court bar, although I submit amicus briefs to the Supreme Court. So even a referral absent a finding of misconduct is a cloud over your head that makes a difference.
Okay. And how does that get discharged, or doesn't it?
Well, basically the D.C. Office of Bar Counsel, which is headed by Gene Shipp, who personally took over my case about a year and a half ago, he decides whether or not I should be charged or whether or not to dismiss the referral, which is what the Maryland Bar did back in 2005.
So you were referred to the Maryland Bar as well, and they dismissed it?
Yes.
Is it unusual for a referral to last 9 years?
Yes. I've heard there have been other ones that have dragged on like this. Obviously, if I was out having sex with clients or commingling client trust funds, I would be disbarred in a heartbeat. So yes, I think it is unusual for them to last this long. But I think it speaks to, a number of scholars have written about politically motivated bar discipline. And as a paying member of the D.C. Bar, I pay my dues every year, and I write with protest at the top. Because I am a member of this bar, and ironically, I served on the D.C. Bar Legal Ethics Committee during this time, from 2005 to 2007. I was writing legal opinions on matters of ethics, because obviously the Legal Ethics Committee and the Disciplinary Committee don't speak to each other. So it's more of the absurd, through-the-looking-glass nature of what we kind of constantly saw during the Bush years. But it's very Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland, yeah. I'm thinking Johnny Depp is about to come out with that new 3D movie, The Mad Hatter.
Yeah.
So you posted something at Daily Kos, and that's what spurred me to contact you. What do you want to accomplish now? What was your goal in posting that to Daily Kos and looking for the mainstream media? What do you want the mainstream media to do?
I wanted the mainstream media to have a counterpoint, to realize that the Bybee treatment that they received from the Department of Justice was highly unorthodox and irregular, and to let them know that my case serves as a counterpoint to that. I think when people are told something and they don't have any facts to counter it, they just have to swallow the party line. So I was trying to give the mainstream media an alternative version of the story that they are being fed by the Justice Department. And I also urged people, anyone who's a member of the public can file a bar complaint. So just because the Justice Department has decided not to refer you and Bybee to the bar doesn't mean that other members of the public, you don't have to be a lawyer, cannot do the same. And I encourage people.
Well, wait, you mean I can go to the Pennsylvania bar and file some kind of a complaint about John Yoo?
Yes, you can. You can say and attach the OPR report. The OPR report actually found that he engaged in intentional misconduct. This is before it was downgraded and softened by David Margolis. But you can say, based on this, I think he should be charged with ethics violations. You can do that.
Do the number of people who sign the complaint have an effect on the bar?
It's hard to say what motivates them in terms of how they look at something. I know apparently there has been the Velvet Revolution group, I think based here in D.C., that has filed a complaint with the D.C. bar against you and Bybee. And so maybe there are referrals. It's something that the bar keeps confidential. In my case, I outed myself as being, having been referred, because at this point I think the secrecy only helps the government to be doing all of this stuff to me under the radar screen. So I am the one who has, publicized, look, I'm on this, I was put on this list. I've been blacklisted. I've been referred to the bar. I've been under criminal investigation. I mean, that's something people normally would not want to advertise. But after a certain point, why should they be allowed to retaliate against me in spades without anyone knowing?
Well, I got to tell you, you've really got my head buzzing with what we can do here in Pennsylvania to make something happen. I'm just wondering if I don't expect a firm answer, but especially not on the radio. But if we put together some kind of a panel with you and Scott, would you consider coming up to Philly and and getting involved in something that might help get some action taking place on this?
Absolutely. In fact, in the very, very early stage of what was going on in my case, and I will be eternally grateful for this forever. But back when I was in the midst of all of this, the Philadelphia Bar Association invited me to come speak in recognition, basically I'm trying to find the exact language they used, but for the very high-handed and unfair way in which I was dealt with by the Department of Justice. And
we're going to have to make something like this happen. This is one thing we can do is we can go after you. And another thing, what about this guy Margolis? Where does he practice? Is he Washington, I guess?
I assume he's licensed. Usually people are licensed in other states and then wave into Washington, D.C. I assume he's probably licensed in D.C. But again, I don't think that would preclude filing a bar complaint against him. Certainly, I think the Philadelphia Bar Association would be sympathetic. I found the actual wording. They had honored me back in 2003 for her conduct as a lawyer at great expense to her personal career. Not only should she be honored for behaving at the highest professional standards, but our commending her in a public way may call attention to the very high-handed and unfair predicament in which she now finds herself. That was in April of 2003 when nobody would come to my defense. So I do have hope in the Philadelphia Bar Association. But at the same time, the Philadelphia Inquirer just gave John Yoo a regular op-ed column. So it's
yes, and when they did, that didn't just happen. That happened the middle or beginning of last year. It's been a while. And when it happened, a whole bunch of protesters went down to the Philadelphia Inquirer. So there are a lot of people who are incensed about that. And the possibility of being able to take action that might lead to accountability on the part of John Yoo is wonderful news. That's really powerful stuff. It's a horrible thought that you've been going through this for so many years. Now, you mentioned that you have an organization. Why don't you talk a little bit about that organization? Maybe we can enlighten some people about it, maybe even some people who need help.
Sure. I work at the Government Accountability Project, which is a nonprofit organization that's the nation's leading whistleblower rights organization. And we represent whistleblowers from both the private and government sector. And we do advocacy, we do litigation, we do a number of different things to represent people in their personal capacities, as well as the greater cause of blowing the whistle on fraud, waste, and abuse. So really, because of what I went through, I decided to dedicate my life to whistleblowers And after, I guess, from 2006 to 2008, I worked for now Congressman Alan Grayson, who at that point was in private practice representing people blowing the whistle on Reconstruction fraud in Iraq. And then
Really?
Grayson, yes, I did. And then Alan Grayson is now a congressman for representing Orlando, Florida. And the law firm has, I guess, disbanded. And
what did he represent? What did he do when you worked for him?
He had a government contracts practice, but he also, he had a boutique, probably one of the only niche boutique practices in the country, specifically going after Reconstruction fraud in Iraq against the usual suspects, KBR, Blackwater. We all know who they are. So I did that for 2 years, and then I took the position as Director of Homeland Security and Human Rights at the Government Accountability Project. So we focus particularly with a special emphasis in looking at torture, and looking at state secrecy, electronic eavesdropping, a lot of civil liberties issues, and government accountability about that, government accountability surrounding that. And that's part of what's so disappointing about